Sure. Well, welcome everyone who joins this wonderful afternoon. A brief introduction about the community before I have Anshuman take it over. So, Tejas Cyber Network is a global community of cyber professionals. So, we're not just limited to practitioners, we also welcome people who are in product management, cyber product management, or engineering folks who are developing cyber products. There's a website which you can use to join the network. A lot of people ask me, hey, what is Tejas? Actually, it has two beautiful meanings. There's a Spanish meaning, and then Tejas is pronounced as Tejas in Spanish, and it means a friend or ally. And what we are trying to build here, which is people with deep friendships and deep allyship, where people are invested in your success. And in yoga, it means strong inner strength. And fun fact is that the state of Texas is actually named after Tejas. So it used to be called Tejas, and now it's called Texas. So that's something new I learned. Uh, we are a private, project-oriented, vendor agnostic, and self-sustaining community. We are open to all. And when I say project oriented, instead of being a loosey goosey community, we have 4 projects that we are aligning all our efforts towards. So one of our design principles is that the community serves you. So anything and everything that we do has to directly help you. So that's the project. We are vendor agnostic, so we don't take money from any vendors. We are not vendor funded or vendor sponsored. We are membership based, so that allows us to be independent.
The philosopher Rousseau considers
Uh,
perfect idiots knowing nothing. The
uh,
human
I think people can mute themselves. And again, we are aiming for your short-term and long-term personal and professional success. Mission is to touch maximum number of people and create maximum impact in our lifetime. These are the 4 community projects I was talking about, which are aligned to people's aspiration. Like if you ask someone that what they want to do, many people want to aspire to C-level position. So that's our first project, Path to CXO. A lot of people want to start companies that instead of climbing the corporate ladder, they want to create the ladder. They want to be job creators. So that's our project here on entrepreneurship. That how do we help people upskill and also uh, uh, work with them on their journey to start their own companies. And project S is around skills, which is technical management and life skills. And the last one, which is very important, which is project H, that how do we get people started on a journey of attaining physical and mental resilience so they can handle adversity with equanimity and utilize all their God-given talents. It's something that we realize late in our careers that we need to take care of ourselves if we are going to enjoy the fruits of our labor. So that said, I'm going to pass it on to Anshuman. Anshuman is a great technologist, deep thinker, and wonderfully, he's very spiritually inclined too. So I'll let him pass on the baton to him to take it from here.
Thank you, Anshu. Appreciate it much. Awesome. I am sharing my screen. So hopefully I'm going to start the slideshow. I have a wide screen and I'm not going to be able to see anybody. So I would suggest if you have questions, we can have a few minutes at the end. So I'm going to start the slideshow. There you go. Cool. Um, awesome. I think we are 6 minutes over, so I think I can get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Anshuman. I am staff security engineer at Lyft, and one of my core responsibilities is to make sure that our customer data, if you ever use a Lyft app, your personal information is secure, thanks to our team and the efforts that we put. But that's not the reason why I'm here today. Today I'm here to talk about scaling AppSec activities using LLMs, and I am here to share some of my experiences that I've been playing a bunch with LLMs and GenAI for the past couple of weeks, months, and I've learned a few things. So I'm just here to share those experiences. I do want to sort of start the presentation saying that this presentation is sort of futuristic, so you will see some ideas thrown at. Um, uh, they these ideas might not be well formed yet, but I have working POCs, and I believe this is the future of at least application security. So just wanted to throw that out there in case you have some confusion or questions. So okay, before I get started, I want to share a quick word or two about my story. So I came to the US for my master's in computer science. I went to ASU. This was almost 16 years ago. I then started my career as a technical consultant for a company called Axway. Um, and then I worked there for a couple of years. And then in 2012 is when my security career actually started. I started off working as a security consultant for a company called Cigital, which was later acquired by Synopsys. I believe there's some folks here on the call that are part of Synopsys now. And then from 2013 onwards up until 2022, I was basically a security engineer in product-based companies. So I've worked for a few of them. You can see the logos there. And then since 2022, I'm on the AppSec team as a tech lead for Lyft. So that's been my journey spanning over 15 or 16 years or so. Okay, what is today's agenda? So I have a problem statement that is related to application security. So I'm going to go over that. I'm going to speak a little bit about the opportunities that we have with generative AI and LLMs. I'll actually walk through a potential approach and also sort of explain how I think about solving like some of the problems that AppSec engineers face on a day-to-day basis. I have a video too I would like to share to show what it would mean in terms of implementation, have some learnings, observations, and then AI agents, right? Like we can't go wrong with that. Just yesterday, Anthropic released computer use. For those who are aware of it, it's wild, right? Like the pace at which the just kind of the AI technologies have been evolving is pretty wild, and I believe AI agents is here to stay. So I'm going to share some of the work that I've been doing there. Um, and then I'll also speak about how we can scale AppSec activities with agents and without agents. So both the scenarios. And then we'll conclude. So that's the agenda for today. And again, if you have questions, I would recommend please save them till the end because I want to make sure I go through the slides. All right. So the problem statement, I've been in the AppSec domain for about 15 years now. And even before we get to the problem statement, I want to discuss like what is the role of AppSec teams in general, right? You'll see this, across different organizations that any application security team's responsibility should be to reduce risk across an organization, right? And how do they do that? They do that by eliminating vulnerabilities or vulnerability classes completely, right? How do they do that? They engage with engineering teams. They make sure proper security controls are baked in the SDLC, so on and so forth, right? And the idea being that we try to identify insecure design practices, vulnerabilities as early on the SDLC, so that we save on the cost to fix them once they are already deployed. And then we also don't want to affect the developer velocity. We want to make sure engineers are doing what they're supposed to do, and they just keep building, right? So these are some sort of principles of any AppSec teams across different organizations. And the way AppSec teams generally engage with engineering teams is basically a multi-step or multiple phases, right? The focus of this presentation is going to be the initial phases where imagine where you haven't started committing code yet, you haven't started building features yet, right? You're still going through the ideation phase, you're still trying to figure out if building something makes sense to the company or not, what are the security risk, vulnerabilities that are getting introduced, so on and so forth, right? So basically, for the purposes of this presentation, I sort of divided the first phases into multiple steps. So the first step would be a risk classification or a risk assessment, right? When an engineering team wants to build something, right, the security engineer's job is to assess the risk which that feature might bring, and then sort of recommend security controls and whatnot. After that, security engineers might do a lightweight security review, and by security review, I mean things like authentication, authorization, encryption, input validation, observability, right? These are some very core principles that any application security engineer should review for things that come through the pipeline, right? So just kind of a brief overview of how AppSec teams engage and what does the engagement flow look like, at least for the initial few phases. After the reviews, obviously, you have the scammings, you have SAST, DAST, all kinds of stuff, right? Those are more applicable when code is actually starting to get committed and undertaken by the engineering teams, right? I believe when we bring in security at those layers, it's already a little too late for that, right? So, like, why not focus on as early as possible? Speaking about engagements, right? If it wasn't obvious, right? Some of the ways AppSec engineers engage is pretty manual intensive, right? Like some of these design reviews, threat modeling, risk classification, these are very manual intensive activities, right? Where the AppSec engineer would have to sit with the engineering team, ask them a bunch of questions, try to understand what is being proposed, and then sort of use their brains and figure out, okay, this is how we want them to do authentication. Are they doing that or not? Right? So as you can see, it's not really scalable. Um, AppSec teams are generally on the smaller side, at least in my experience, where I think the ratio could be anywhere from, I don't know, like 1 to 100. At Lyft, I can speak for Lyft. We are a team of 3 people taking care of the AppSec of the entire company, right? So you can just imagine the scale, right? So obviously, we want to be in a world where we are reducing risk in a way that is scalable and it is not overwhelming for AppSec engineers, right? And if the engagement flows uh, if the engagement starts with these manual activities, how do we actually scale ourselves, right? So these are some pretty common limitations. It's time consuming. There's no feedback loop. Once we do the review, if you're not doing anything with the artifacts, right? Like how do we ensure that we are learning from our mistakes and just keep like improving that feedback loop, right? It is also subjective based on the skill set. If a junior engineer reviews something versus a senior engineer, even if you have a specific format, I have seen that the outcomes are very subjective based on their experiences, right? So these are all very common problems, I believe, in the manual approach of AppSec, right? Okay, so here's where I want to take a few minutes to discuss the opportunity we have in front of us with generative AI and LLMs. And even before I dive into that, I'm assuming if you've seen the presentation talk, you sort of understand what LLMs are. Basically, they're capable of understanding and generating human-like text, right? And when you think about application security, when we are supposed to do the reviews and whatnot, those are all specification documents written in human language, right? And that's what we're supposed to review. So I feel like LLMs are very apt for sort of this problem statement, where the idea is to evaluate the human language and sort of glean insight from them and then go and do your thing, right? So why LLMs in AppSec? I already mentioned a few things, right? We don't want to be doing the mundane, manual things every day. Even if they bring value, I'm not saying that LLMs are going to replace AppSec engineers. That's not what I'm saying. I want to make sure that I am super clear on that. The idea being that would you rather have an AppSec engineer spend hours and days to try to just figure out what is being proposed versus the AppSec engineer is presented an outcome. Okay. Yeah. Versus a scenario where the AppSec engineer is actually presented an outcome which has already gone through the LLM review workflow, right? For me personally, I've been playing with this and I think it's saving me so much time on my day-to-day basis. Things that were taking me an hour, 2 hours, it's literally taking me like seconds now, right? So that's what I think I want the audience to get out of this presentation is the idea is to augment AppSec engineers and not to replace them, right? And obviously, with the way LLMs work, you can have it uh, produce structured output, let's say JSON. You can also have it produce unstructured output, right? And the fact that we have these flexibilities, it actually helps because we could use those artifacts to sort of build this feedback loop, which I mentioned in the previous slide, right? Because once we do the review, we want to make sure we are doing something with those artifacts. And I think this is where LLMs also shine because you can provide it a structure with all the prompts and whatnot, and will give you exactly that output, right? I've heard some concerns about reliability and consistency. Those are all valid concerns in the AI landscape, but I don't want to focus on those things. Those are things that could be improved, and as the technologies evolve, as OpenAI, Anthropic, they come up with newer models, I think that problem will slowly tend to become, sort of lesser problems. And the majority of focus would be how do we actually leverage these technologies. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, one other concept in the AI landscape is this idea of a RAG assistant or a retrieval augmented generation, right? The simplest way to think about it is, so let's say you work in an organization and your organization has a set of best practices, cloud security policies, application security policies, and like whatnot, right? Generally, in my experience, what I've seen is these policies are just there. They are very difficult to enforce, and security engineers, they don't, at least they might be aware of what's inside them, but when it comes to the review, we don't actually go and review those policies statement by statement, right? So in my experience, I think policies are good for compliance reasons, but they're not really helpful for practitioners, right? So a RAG or a retrieval augmented generation, you can think of it like if there's a system where you upload all the policies and best practices, right? And the system is smart enough to know, like if you ask it a question, okay, how do I do authentication in my organization? It is smart enough to know where to find that answer amongst all the best practices, right? And then it will give you that exact answer as compared to, so let's say we have Confluence or Jira, right? Me as an AppSec engineer, I would go and search for those things in Confluence, right? So again, the concept of a RAG assistant is very powerful because you can ask it a question and it will give you the answer that is specific to your organization. It is not going on the internet and searching for answers. You can build an internal RAG assistant that is very focused and specific to your organization. So you can also think of it like a security oracle or a security GPT, right? Um, Okay, so but now that we've spoken about some of the basic and fundamentals of LLMs and RAGs and whatnot, how could we use some of those frameworks and technologies in order to actually solve some of the AppSec problems, right? So this figure that you see on the screen, you can think of it like a security review process funnel, right? Where it all starts with a technical specification document, which an engineering team might have if they were to build something, right? This mostly applies to new features and products, but this could also apply to existing features. If they want to make a change, they'll probably have to go through some kind of a process, right? So it starts with this specification document and it goes through a bunch of activities. And for the purpose of this POC, I'm going to do 3 activities. Risk classification, where the idea is to understand what is being proposed, whether it is an externally facing feature or not, whether it has customer data or not, whether the data classification aligns with your organization or things like that, right? And then we'll try to understand the risk classification of this new feature, and then we'll assign a risk score, right? This risk score would allow any teams to sort of get good visibility of what are the risks that are being introduced, how do we address them, so on and so forth. After that, this idea of rapid risk assessment, for folks who have heard about Mozilla's RRA framework, this is actually the exact same framework where, so now that you have a good understanding of the risk classification, can we sort of, brainstorm some threat actors, some impact on confidentiality, integrity, availability? Can you help come up with some recommendations based on the specification itself, right? So that is what the rapid risk assessment is. And then the third piece is the security review. Security review, you can think of it like, you focus on certain things like authentication, authorization, observability, right? You want to make sure if a specification document has those details, as a security engineer, you're supposed to understand what they're doing and actually compare them with the best practices, right? So again, these 3 activities are something an app engineer would do or engage manually. But if we can solve this using LLMs with reasonable accuracy, then why not, right? So that is what I'm trying to propose here. And then in the end would be a security review that the app engineers could then use to sort of make informed decisions about where they need to spend their attention, right? All right, so how do we do that? This diagram might be a little overwhelming for some folks, so please stay with me. I'll try to explain it in simpler terms. There are basically 3 steps. Step 1, step 2A to 2D, and then step 3, right? Step 1 is where it starts with the specification document when somebody could upload it, right? The content of that specification document is parsed using some functions and whatnot. And then step 2A to 2D are essentially these activities which I spoke about. Step 2A is the risk classification. Step 2B is the rapid risk assessment. And 2C and 2D are security reviews in two different ways. I'll go into the two different ways in a bit, but I just want to focus on the risk classification piece for a second. So you can see here that essentially what we send to the LLMs are three things. The parse content, right? Like the things that we parse from the specification, the risk query and risk instructions. These are basically prompts at the end of the day, right? You sort of explain the LLM, how do you want to classify the risk? If your organization has a risk framework, if there's certain things that are custom to the organization, you can explain all of that in human language and you can provide those as instructions to the LLM, right? And then the query would be, okay, so now that you have the framework, you have the context, what do you want it to do, right? So that would go on the instructions piece. And then you would just kind of send all of this to the LLMs and you would explain that, look, I want your risk classification in a JSON format, right? And then the LLM would do its thing. It will give you the JSON output, right? Pretty straightforward. Same thing with the rapid risk assessment. You can provide the Mozilla's RRA framework guide as the instructions, and then you can ask the LLM to do a rapid risk assessment based on the past context, right? For the security reviews, I found out that there are two ways we could go about it. First way is obviously to just kind of, uh, instruct the LLM to find insights about authentication, authorization, so on and so forth, right? The second way is actually more effective is when the RAG concept comes into play. So you can think of it like you can build an in-memory RAG assistant using your best practices, right? And I'll show you what that means after this slide. But the idea being that if you can curate a RAG, a smart security assistant with your best practices, you can actually use that to perform the security review on the content, right? You don't have to provide instructions, detailed instructions. You can just ask it things like, okay, how do we do authentication in this organization? Now, can you go and read the specification and see if they're following those best practices, right? So it's I like that comparison, but you're actually doing the comparison with a smart assistant as opposed to just providing those instructions to the LLM, right? And then in the end, step three is basically you consolidate all of the outputs from these different steps and you provide a holistic sort of a review that includes a risk classification assessment and review to the end user, right? So this is basically the general overview of how I see we can automate some of the things using LLMs, right? Okay, so now I want to show you a quick video that I recorded. I didn't want to take the risk of doing it live. So before I go there, I want to show you three things. And these are all available on my GitHub profile. You can go to 121BH, AppSec AI artifacts, right? The idea being I have come up with three best practices guide. This one is for authentication, right? You can see that, again, these are intentionally created just to show uh, the proof of concept. So they're not something that is being used anywhere. And you can see that in authentication, right? They actually have recommended authentication methods. Let's say Envoy authentication. This particular organization wants you to use Envoy proxy as your authentication mechanism, right? So this is very custom to this particular organization. So this is authentication. For encryption, they also recommend to use AES with certain key size and whatnot, right? And they also have other recommendations about TLS using TLS 1.2, SFTP or FTP, things like that, right? Again, this could be very specific to organizations. So I just want to show that. And then finally, for the logging best practices, you have things like use do not log sensitive information such as passwords, PII. I feel like this is a pretty standard logging practices, but I think it helps to have these in documentation, right? And then the fourth document is the technical specification document that I actually want the LLM workflow to review, right? And in this, you can see that they're pretty blatant mistakes, right? Like the specification is proposing to build a proprietary encryption algorithm. Now, if you hear this from any company, you will be like, yeah, you should not rule your own crypto, right? Like, why build your proprietary encryption algorithm? Same thing for logging. It says implement logging that captures all system outputs and process. Again, it's a very bad advice, right? So you can see that there's some pretty blatant red flags in the specification document. And if I, as an engineer, if I were to review this, I need to find these things, right? So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to pass this specification document to the LLM workflow and see what it produces, right? So let's do that. I have a demo here. I'm gonna click on play. So you can see that I'll keep stopping and then explaining what's going on. The first step here is it actually creating an in-memory RAG assistant, right? Based on the three practices I showed, authentication, encryption, logging, this system is actually creating an in-memory RAG assistant. Now, it doesn't have to be an in-memory assistant. This could be a totally different system. But again, I'm just kind of showing what it is capable of. So I'm doing it in memory, right? And then it is asking the user to upload the specification file, right? So once the user uploads the specification document, you can see that it'll go through a series of steps. It will do the rapid risk assessment, security review, risk classification, so on and so forth, right? So let's give it a couple of seconds. And this whole process, I have like sped it up a little bit, but this does not take more than a minute. Like it's pretty fast. So now you can see that, it went through all of the steps. The first thing it showed was the risk classification, right? Based on the specification, it found out that there was going to be a new service which you're proposing. It's only going to be internal. The data classification is sensitive and restricted. It does not require any authentication, so on and so forth, right? Now, again, this is specific to what I built. You could easily change the risk classification framework to whatever works for your organization, right? And then you can see that it also assigned a risk score. So it thinks that it is a high level risk. And this is helpful, right? Because as an AppSec engineer, I know exactly what it is capable of and I know what I need to do next, right? Instead of me going and figuring out uh, what the specification is about, right? So that's cool. Let's continue forward. Here, you can see that in the rapid risk assessment, it actually found two glaring things, right? Like the first one is the proprietary algorithm. It found out that the specification is proposing usage of proprietary algorithm and it does not want you to do that. Same thing with logging sensitive data and encryption keys, right? It found out that there's extensive logging in the system. So I'm just kind of highlighting those things. Okay, this is, I think, the most awesome thing that at least I feel is relevant is, so after it did the rapid risk assessment, it tried to do the security review, right? And in security review, there are different sections, right? Authentication, authorization. For authentication, you can see that the current state is the specification does not mention any form of user authentication, which is true, right? And then in the recommendation, it actually gave the Envoy proxy. So this actually shows that the recommendation is coming from the internal RAG assistant. It's not just going on the internet and finding good ways of authentication, right? And I think this is where the power really is you can build something like this internally with no access to the internet. So you don't have to worry about the privacy implications of sending your data to OpenAI Anthropic. And the recommendations are very concise and apt for what the teams are trying to do. So yeah, you can see that it recommends using on by proxy, and it also cites the source, which is the best practice. Same thing for authorization. I think authorization also it found out this RBAC. Same thing for encryption. Even in encryption, right, it cited that we wanted to use AES with 128 bits. It also cited this source, right? If you've ever operated as a security engineer, doing something like this, you know that it requires manual effort. You have to know what the best practices are. You have to understand what is being proposed, and then you have to sort of club both the things together, right? So if you have a system that can do that, that is smart enough to do that, then why not, right? So that's the idea basically. Um, yeah, and I think moving on, same thing with logging, monitoring, alerting. And again, these are sections that I gave in the prompt. If I wanted to extract other insights that might be specific to your organization, all I have to do is change the prompt, right? Because I feel most of these workflows using LLMs are prompts at the end of the day. If your prompts are good enough, if you know what you want to extract, you can make your prompts like in that way, right? And I think I've played around with the prompts as well. The moment I make the prompts generic enough, I see that these insights kind of get lost, right? So I think it's all about uh, trial, like keep iterating on the prompts, and then I'm sure you will find a way where you're able to extract exactly the information which you need, right? So yeah, just wanted to show this demo. I think there's some value in here. Uh, so skipping to some of the learnings and observations, and I think it's like you hear folks speak about AI agents and LLMs and generative AI, and like there's so much promise and there's so many opportunities. Obviously, it comes with its drawbacks and some things that I believe could be improved as well. So I feel like, if not the review itself, the insights that it shows you are pretty spot on. It is able to summarize a large corpus of information and extract the relevant information. Uh, the detailed report which you saw, it's actually pretty detailed. Like it can create an outcome that is worth 3 or 4 pages, right? But it also provides a good high level overview, right? Um, Obviously something like this would work well if you have a specific format that is being followed in your organization for writing specification documents. If there's no format, building a system is kind of difficult, right? So I think there's some pre-processing steps that might be required in certain places, and I think that's worth calling out. I already spoke about this, but the idea is to augment security engineers, right? And I stress this enough is using LLMs does not mean that we are replacing or we're going to replace everybody. It's just they're going to make our lives easier. The things that were taking me days literally takes me seconds, right? Um, Image parsing is not trivial. So like when you think about specification documents, you probably imagining architecture, visuals, and whatnot, right? I found out that is probably one of the most difficult problems in this space, right? Like, how do you take a very complex AWS architecture and try to transcribe it in words, explaining each and every component and how the data is flowing from one component to the other component? So I think this is an area that can improve quite a bit. Is if there's a service that can take any document, no matter how complex it is, and if it can transcribe the architectures in the diagram in simple English, then I think we could use that feature, that service, as part of this workflow. Um, One thing I've observed is using the RAG assistant, right, like the smart assistant that knows about the security best practices. If you use the RAG assistant to perform the security review, I find that the recommendations are more concise and more appropriate, right? Which makes sense, right? Because it knows about the organization. Um, and then, yeah, I think the workflow that I showed was used using GPT-4o, which, and I think there's a newer models that have come after that that are better with reasoning and sort of explaining how they do things. So, if I'm able to achieve so much with just GPT-4o, right, I can only imagine when newer models come, how the efficiency is going to improve drastically, I feel. Okay, cool. So we're 34 minutes in, perfect. Um, so far, what I sort of explained and showed was kind of a very basic LLM use case, right? Where I'm just kind of going step by step. I'm going first, I'm doing the rapid risk assessment, I'm doing the security review, so on and so forth, right? Now, if I take a step back and if I think about this problem space holistically, right? Like I'm not just uh, concentrating myself to application security. If I take vulnerability management, if I take cloud security, right? There are these activities, so to speak, that are common amongst different security teams. Like if we take the risk classification, right? Risk classification is something that I believe AppSec teams do and should be doing, and also the privacy teams, right? If if something is coming through the privacy workflow, and if a team wants to know if it is okay to build something like this or not, the first thing that the privacy team would want to do is the risk classification, right? So how do you build a system where you're basically building these small workflows and other teams could also use them, right? And I think this is where the concept of AI agents makes perfect sense, right? This is like sort of a hypothetical vision diagram that I feel like we could build. But the idea being, there's this AI agent ecosystem. You could use whatever frameworks you want. There's OpenAI Swarm, there's Crew AI, so on and so forth. And then there's this idea of agents specific to different domains. So there could be a suite of vulnerability management agents who do scanning, who do contextualization, correlation, so on and so forth, right? Similarly, for AppSec, whatever we did before, right, like the 3 steps, there could be agents to do those 3 steps, right? Now, I understand this might be an overkill. Like if I'm already able to achieve the outcome I want without agents, then why do I have to use agents? That is a fair argument, and I'm not going to argue with that. But I just wanted to see if it is possible to build an agentic framework to replicate, whatever I did before without agents, and I think it is, right? And the section over here obviously shows that we could have these different agents speak to the same assistant. So it's like a security oracle for the entire company, right? So yeah, this is basically I think something that could be built and it could be very useful. All right, so So now when we sort of jog our memory back to the previous architecture which I showed, right, without agents, how can we do that with agents, right? So this architecture that you see is pretty similar to the old one. The biggest difference is now each of the steps, right, like the risk classification, risk assessment, and the security reviews, they are basically agents now, right? And the idea of agents being that agents will have certain functions, right? So, for example, the risk classify agent will have a function where it will perform the risk classification, right? I was in the previous architecture, I was doing it in code, but now if I use an agentic framework, I can simply explain what the risk classification should be like. I can write a function around it, and I can associate that function with this agent, right? And then the orchestrator framework, I'm using OpenAI's Swarm. You can sort of create these agents and have the framework take control of how the data is being handed off from one agent to the other agent, right? So it is smart enough to know when the risk classification is complete, the flow needs to be sent back to the rapid risk assessment agent, right? So there's a lot of flexibilities in how you want to orchestrate these agents, right? And there's obviously that AI piece to it, where even if you ask it at a high level, it will still do the job, right? Even if it does not understand, because I think that's the idea of agents is you assign it a purpose, right? Like you're supposed to do risk classification only, and then it will go and figure out, okay, what are the functions I have, what are the sources I have, am I attached to any RAG assistant or not, right? So it is its job to figure out how is it going to achieve that outcome, and I think there's some value in there, right? Cool. So yeah, I wanted to quickly show the demo for the agents as well. I have one for that. So yeah, it's the same steps, right? Like you first start by building this in-memory RAG assistant with the 3 documents, and then you ask the user to upload the files, right? So the flow is pretty same, um, and the outcome is also very similar, which you will see, right? You will see that the risk classification is actually happening by the agent now, right? The scores are slightly different, but that's okay. The rapid risk assessment is also happening by an agent. And you can see that some of the recommendations are pretty similar. They're in fact the same thing, right? And then in the end, the security review also found out that there was no authentication mechanism, and then it cited this, right? So again, just kind of wanting to show that it is possible to do something like this with agents and without agents, right? Now, where do we use agents? I think it's a topic, and I think folks are still trying to figure out which makes perfect, like which use case makes sense to use agents and which use case does not. But I think the more we experiment, the more complex use cases we have, I think we get more clarity. Okay, I think that's, yeah. So to conclude, right, AppSec processes, especially those that involve human, engagement, they're not efficient and they don't scale. LLMs offer a viable solution, even if they're not 100% accurate, even if they're not reliable. If we can use LLMs to augment us and make some of that pre-work easier for us, then I think we should do that, right? Um, I see a lot of people being skeptical about AI taking their jobs and whatnot. I am the complete opposite, and like with the pace at which some of these technologies are evolving, if you don't, if people don't try to change their perspective of how they think about AI, I think it's only going to get difficult, right? As these things become more complex. But not everything will need AI agents. I already spoke about that. So, it's important to take a step back and evaluate whether the problem that you're trying to solve could be solved without agents or with agents, right? And then all this is pretty greenfield. What I showed you today is something I've been working for the past few weeks. And it was just kind of me experimenting with a bunch of things and trying to think, okay, how can I make my life easier, right? And yeah, so there's so much room for improvement, and I'm really excited about the future. That's pretty much it. These are some of my socials. If you liked what you saw, if you wanna stay connected, please feel free to reach out. I'm actually gonna publish a blog sometime today or tomorrow that goes over some of the more inner workings of how this whole workflow is. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll stop there and yeah, see if there are any questions.
Suman, one question here. So yeah, you can hear me okay? I don't know.
Yes, I can.
So we're thinking of something similar to this, and it was very close to what you showed in the slide as the agent, future agents and stuff like that. So the knowledge base, right? This is going to be a totally a private setup. Is you're not going to let
Yeah.
your model to go and search all over the internet. It's going to be difficult to implement such a thing in a corporate setup. So how will you kind of create the knowledge base and how will you train it? You know, say for example, it's for SAST and DAST. It's going to be huge, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how will be that? It should look like a payload and stuff like that, right? So how will you
Yeah.
really create that?
Yeah, I think for SaaS and Dash, I don't know the answer, to be honest. That is, obviously that's a more complex topic because you're dealing with code. You're no longer dealing with human language, right? And when it comes to code, you need to understand the source sync, how the data flows, how they relate to endpoints and whatnot, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that is essentially an area that needs a lot of research, innovation. But I think the concept of building an internal assistant, right, where I don't know if you could just provide it a control flow graph and say that, look, this is the path, this is the golden path that I want you to trace across all different implementations, and then you evaluate all PRs according to that. Could be an approach. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, so that's something you're thinking for the future. That's what you meant by that slide, and you're still working on
Yes,
that. Sounds
yes,
good.
sir.
Thank you. Cheers. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
If I
Yes,
go next.
yes, Murat.
Yeah, hey, I'm Shaman, Murad
Hi.
from ShareFile. Thanks for this presentation. I was kind of like starting the same journey, and thanks for this community to have this opportunity, right? Obviously. So my case is a bit maybe not simpler, but more concrete in a sense. I'm building a threat modeling chat app. So like on the Streamlight UI that you showed on
Yeah,
the Bedrock, AWS, LangChain, and Cloud Sonnet 3.5.
yeah,
Constrained to the AWS, right? So that then nothing leaves my account. Two
yeah,
questions. Is the one that you showed today, the risk assessment review, is this in production used by okay, so this is more of a
yeah,
POC.
yeah. Yes, yes,
And then the second one is the context, like the knowledge base, right? Obviously, you want to make it more concrete towards the lift, the same challenge I
yeah,
have now. So it's pretty generic, right? So it just show
yes,
you hey, authentication, like secure here, secure there, but what it means
yeah,
to the end user or the security
yeah,
engineer working on that lift, right?
yeah,
What is your plan for to make it very narrow and specific to have a like better result from the app, right? And
yeah.
how you plan to leverage the lift specific knowledge base and how you so these are the same questions I have for myself.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think for the first question, yeah, this is just like a POC kind of a thing that we are experimenting like internally. And I don't think this needs to be even in production, right? Because if something comes along my way to review it, I could just start something locally and I can do this, right? So it works for my use cases, but obviously there's more room for improvement. As for the other question, how do you train that? How do you make sure the knowledge base is up to date? I think that's essentially an area that is sort of beyond my skill set. I think that is something that an ML engineer or like a data scientist, I would want help from something like that, right? Because the way I think about it is uh, consolidating the documentation is the first problem. In all the companies I've been at, right, there's security best practices spread out in different places. They could be in Confluence, Google Docs, Jira, what have you, right? So consolidating that in like one place is probably the first piece of the puzzle, right? After that, yes, you could vectorize the files, you could sort of attach it to an assistant, right? But then I think from there onwards, there are two problems I see is how do you keep that information up to date, right? If something changes, how do you change that in the vectorized files of the assistant? That's one problem. And I think the second problem which you mentioned was how do you give recommendations that are very concise and appropriate for what is being proposed? And I think for that, it would have to be some kind of fine tuning, retraining, something along those lines, which again, I don't necessarily understand quite well because my job is a security engineer, right? But I think that's an area that has a lot of room for improvement is how do you keep fine tuning your RAG assistant that gives tailored advice to what is being proposed, right? And I think there's some element of that feedback loop, right? Based on the outcomes that it is able to generate, can you augment something to it, or can you make it smarter, saying that, look, the outcome that you gave is good, but then if you gave this as well, that would be even better, right? So
Mm.
I'm assuming there's some kind of retraining involvement there. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think about it.
Thanks. Yeah, there's no shortcut.
Yeah, there's no shortcut. Yeah. Yeah, I see a bunch of. Aki, do you want to go next?
Sure. Congratulations for this wonderful event. Yeah, kudos.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I see the potential of LLMs. My and you briefly already touched about this topic of RAG, knowledge base, how to ensure that it is up to date, right? That is one of the challenge that you already answered. My question
Yeah.
was about the security of that knowledge base itself. Who is having access to those documentation?
Mhm.
Right, so thinking from some of the sensitive documentation which might be only to be authorized for certain teams and certain groups. So have you thought any considerations about that as well?
Um, Yes and no. I say yes because there's some documentation that is generally available to view by anybody in the company, right? Like information security policy, cloud security policy, things like that, right? They are very generic things that are accessible. So I don't think access control sort of applies there. But yes, I think access control or authorization is a big issue in systems that use RAGs, right? Where if you are sort of building the system by vectorizing these files, how are you ensuring that a person who is able to query that system has access to that document or not, right? I think there's a white paper for that. I can share it after the link. Like, but the idea being that before you vectorize or while you vectorize, there has to be some data associated with that file saying that this role or this user has access to this document. So when the user tries to query the system, it is only showing the results based on whatever documents they have access to. Again, I am sort of simplifying it, but it's a very complex system to build in a way that takes care of access control at different layers across different teams, right? Because companies might be using Okta or like some of these big name vendors to provision IAM rules and whatnot. How do you integrate those systems with something like this? I think is a bigger challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, thank you so much for that. The reason why I raise this is because sometimes when anything gets injected to these databases, that
Mhm.
poisons further chain in the downstream applications, and then it becomes
Yeah,
everything
it
becomes
becomes a
poison,
mess.
right? So we
Yes,
need to
yes.
be really careful
Yeah,
about that.
I think data provenance and data governance and just kind of how AI is coming to these conclusions. If you can track the reasoning, I think that is very important. And I believe there's a law that has been passed recently, or maybe there's an organization that is focused on uh, how do we trust the outcomes generated by LLMs, right? I think the way we do that is by seeing how they're thinking about the problems, how the LLM is thinking and reasoning, right? And yeah, I think it's a difficult problem because at some point, right, like we are dealing with non-humans. We are dealing with so like, there is a trust factor which will take some time to build. How do you build that? I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, Shiva Rajendran, go for it.
Hey Anshu, nice presentation by the way. So I just want to ask a couple of questions. One is, when you build the RAG assistant, what kind of models have you used? Because you were mentioning OpenAI, but when we were using it internally for, let's say, for a threat modeling or any kind of assessment, when you pass the data, it calls via OpenAI, and it's kind of violating the company policy because you're putting the internal data goes via OpenAI, and we don't know how OpenAI, because it also reads from the models and kind of improves its own surface. So
Yeah,
how do we use it? Because not every company has their own NVIDIA to process their own model and run it.
yeah,
So I mean,
yeah,
what's the best way when we consider security and not violating the company policy and build our
yeah,
own drag model and utilize it efficiently? Like, what is
yeah,
your thought on that?
yeah. I think that's a great question, and I I won't have a good answer to this just because I think at some point it comes down to how much a risk you're willing to accept as an organization. In other words, if you can sign a contract with OpenAI saying that, look, we might unintentionally send you data that is internal and customer sensitive. Can you ensure us that you're not using the data to train your models? Or so I think there's some legal ways that you can go about it. Is you're okay to send the data to OpenAI, but then but as you're doing that, you do have the risk of sending proprietary information. So yeah, I think that's a very difficult question to answer right off the bat. I think it really depends on the use case. What are you trying to solve? What are the risks? What are the advantages? What are the drawbacks? Right? Yeah, and like figure out ways to sort of get around the problem of sending customer information. Like one example I can share is, so at Lyft, and I'll try not to give out too much, but we are building this thing called AI proxy, right? AI proxy is basically a system where all the outbound traffic going to OpenAI or Anthropic, they have to go through this proxy, right? And at the proxy layer, we have some controls of doing PII scanning or doing a bunch of other security controls, right? So that is one way where you could build a RAG assistant internally, but then as you're sending traffic to OpenAI, you could introduce another layer where you do a bunch of validations and whatnot, right? Yeah.
Okay, and what about this Llama thing, which is open source and all the stuff? Do you think might be better to use that instead of OpenAI, or doesn't matter, whatever it is, the data might always be in and
Yeah.
out? Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any hard opinions on which model, which company, just kind of use whatever works for you. Yeah,
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
thank you. Hari.
Hi, Anshuman.
Hi.
I'm a master student from Texas A&M University, and I have built a RAG application of my own. And right now, I'm a research assistant working on building another RAG application. So I have two questions regarding your applications and agents. So what are the different types of security mechanisms that you have for prompt injection attacks? Because your OpenAI offers their own moderation model versus you can build your own custom guardrails. So how does it? What are the ideas you have for this current prototype of yours? Would you be able to trust OpenAI with their security mechanisms, or would you be coming up with your own? And the second question is, what are the different evaluation frameworks you have for your RAG, and how do you handle the results from those evaluations? How do you approve that? What makes you say that, okay, this is good and this is bad? Do you have to go through everything and manually do it again, which is a waste of time? So I have doubts in these two domains.
Got it. Yeah, I'll take your second question first. The evaluation piece, I think that is where I don't have anything right now to evaluate. And I think that is essentially why it's not safe to put something like this in production, right? And I think that is also an area of growth for me, right? Like I don't understand how, to evaluate these outcomes, right? So if you have ideas or if you're building something similar, please feel free to reach out. I think that is essentially the next phase of this, like POC is how can we build a system that we can trust the outcomes and trust it in a way that is auditable and whatnot. So yeah, the evaluation piece is something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It is out of my comfort zone, right? Like I don't understand how evaluations work. But yeah, if I learn something about it, if I can build something, I will make sure I share it with the community, right? So that's one thing. Your first question about prompt injections and trusting OpenAI's security practices, man, that's also an interesting question. I think building something like this just for internal use cases or personal experimentation, yeah, you don't have to worry about these things, right? But when it comes to productionalizing this, right, like if I were to make this application available to Lyft engineers, right, yes, I would have to think about, okay, can this be exploited using prompt injection attacks, right? And I think at that point, uh, trying to understand how you're solving these problems at the company level, and then if you can implement or integrate those solutions into your application would make more sense, right? So in other words, I just kind of shared the AI proxy approach, right? So yeah, I would try to integrate the AI proxy with this application, right? So that I am able to evaluate any attempts of prompt injection and whatnot. So I think what I'm trying to say is I would want to integrate this application with other systems that bring security by default.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, that's great to hear. And these are good projects. All the best on
Yeah.
them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, but just one thing on the prompt injection one, I think it's a really difficult one to solve. Not like SQL injection or cosas, because we know it's our code where it is and how to fix it. But prompt injection, is not something at a company level as well. It's difficult because it's open AI, right? So
Yeah.
today, like there are already prompt injections and people have been fixing that, but it's natural language, so you can't block or allow list
Yeah.
something like that. So it's a really huge problem. There are some things that like a guardrail that NVIDIA has released, like you
Yeah.
have another LLM sitting to do the like a WAF, like consider that is its job is just to review this prompt for security issues
Yeah.
and even to see the output if it has any sensitive data that it is trying to extract, right? So there is another LLM. So there are some research around this that or theories that they propose, but it's a really difficult problem to solve in itself, I feel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I couldn't agree more with that. I think it's basically you use another LLM to solve the
Right.
problem of LLM. Yeah, so I think at Lyft we are currently using LLM Guard under the hood, right? LLM Guard is something similar to the like a framework that you can use to evaluate. So, but the idea being that how do you make it transparent to an end user so that they don't know what's happening behind the scenes, they don't know what kind of validations are happening, right? Because the moment you start to sort of make usage of certain frameworks compulsory is when the friction starts to happen. So doing that in a transparent manner and doing that with well-informed decisions is a difficult problem. I agree.
Yeah.
Cool.
So on that note, I have one
Go ahead.
question, Anshuman. So
Yes.
with the output that you get of the reviews, with all the specifications that you provide and the prompt that you have behind the scenes, do you have you encountered any hallucinations because you use RAG? What is there any? What's your insight on hallucinations
Yeah.
and the output that it gives?
Yeah, a great question. So surprisingly, I haven't seen a lot of hallucination, and I think that's happening because in the prompt, I've made sure that I instruct the LLM to only give me output when it is confident, right? Like if I think I have a sentence or two along the lines of, only give me the recommendation if you can cite the source in your RAG source, something like that. And I haven't seen a lot of hallucination. I think instead of hallucination, what I have seen, I'll say, is some recommendations that are not super appropriate. Also, when I run the workflow twice, 3 times in a row, the recommendations actually change. And I think that's where the consistency and the reliability come into play is how do I make sure the output of the security review is consistent every time I run, right? I don't know hallucination is that big of a problem in this system, but I think there are other problems as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's it. We are on time, Anshu. I'll hand it over.